Picture this. You are standing in a queue at the grocery store. The person in front of you is taking just, I don't know, a fraction of a second too long to find their payment card. Or maybe you are sitting at your desk and you hit this 5-second lull while a really complex document saves on your computer.
Right, just a tiny gap in the day.
Exactly. Or there is a brief, entirely normal pause in a conversation with a friend while they take a sip of coffee. And before you have even consciously registered that tiny gap in time, your hand is moved to your pocket, your thumb is swiping across a smooth glass screen, and your attention is suddenly miles away from the physical space your body is actually occupying.
That makes total sense. And the speed of that physical reflex is really what makes it so remarkable to observe. I mean, by the time your conscious mind realizes you are looking at a screen, the whole physical sequence, the reach, the grip, the unlock, it has already been executed by your basal ganglia.
Oh.
Yeah, it operates entirely outside of your executive control. It is very much like shifting gears in a car you have driven for 10 years. You don't think about the clutch, you just do it.
And the most striking part about it is the total absence of a trigger. You didn't pick it up as it vibrated.
Right.
You didn't suddenly remember an urgent email you had to send. Nobody needed you. You just picked it up because a vacuum of stimulation opened up in your physical environment for like 3 seconds.
Yeah.
Welcome to TalkKast. Because understanding that automatic phantom grab reflex is really the key to making sense of our daily mental state. Because when a behavior becomes that deeply encoded into our nervous system, it stops being just some quirky modern habit.
It absolutely does.
It becomes a window into how our immediate physical environment is fundamentally rewiring our baseline cognition. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to stop thinking of the phone as just a neutral object and start understanding it as a highly tuned stimulus system.
That is a crucial distinction, because what makes this specific habit so insidious is the feeling of absolute normalcy. I mean, when you find that piece of glass in your hand during a grocery store queue, it doesn't feel like a lapse in judgment.
No, not at all.
It doesn't feel like you're losing control of your faculties or anything dramatic. It doesn't even feel like you made an active decision. It just feels like the default state of being human in this century.
That is so true. It just feels like breathing at this point.
Exactly. And that invisible, frictionless quality is precisely why we need to examine the mechanics behind it. Because if it felt like a compulsion, we would fight it. But it just feels like, well, nothing.
Let's start by looking at the fundamental language we use, because I think the way we categorize these devices in our minds is really the first trap. We have this linguistic tendency to talk about phones as if they are just tools.
Right, the tool metaphor.
Yeah, we compare them, conceptually, to a kettle, or a pen, or a bicycle. And the mental model there is, they are useful when you require them, and they are inert and completely irrelevant when you don't.
But that is fundamentally flawed.
Right. Because if you put a pen down on your desk, it doesn't actively try to pull your attention back to it. A kettle doesn't quietly demand that you think about boiling water while you are trying to read a book on the sofa.
That is a perfect way to frame it. The word tool implies passivity. A tool literally waits for human intention. But what we are carrying in our pockets is not passive. It is an environment.
An environment? Tell me more about that.
Well, a modern smartphone is a highly tuned, aggressively optimized stimulus system. It is architected specifically to capture attention, to sustain that attention, and then to actively pull your attention back the exact moment your gaze begins to drift.
I see. So it's not waiting for you. It's working on you.
Exactly. When you combine the visual language of notifications, the psychological weight of message previews, the gamification of these daily streaks, and the frictionless slide of infinite algorithmic feeds, you are no longer interacting with a utility.
You're entering a world.
You're entering a comprehensive psychological ecosystem. And it is an ecosystem that travels with you into your bed, into your bathroom, and into your most intimate conversations.
And that ecosystem interacts directly with some of the oldest, most deeply preserved wiring in the human brain. I mean, most people listening to this are already well aware that dopamine isn't just the pleasure chemical.
Right. That is a huge misconception.
We know it's about anticipation and motivation. But I think we need to push past that basic understanding and look at the actual mechanism of reward prediction error. Because the phone isn't just giving us dopamine, it's exploiting the exact algorithm our brains use to learn what is valuable in the world.
What's fascinating here is that reward prediction error is truly the crucial mechanism. Your brain is constantly, and I mean constantly, generating predictions about what is going to happen next in your environment.
Like a subconscious guessing game.
Yes. And if you expect a minor reward and you happen to receive a massive reward, your brain releases a surge of dopamine to say, essentially, pay attention to what just happened and memorize the exact steps it took to get here.
That makes sense. It wants you to repeat the success.
Precisely. But on the flip side, if you expect a reward and get nothing, dopamine levels actually drop below your baseline.
And that feels bad.
It feels like a mild physical discomfort. It is a craving. And the platforms on our devices are absolute masterclasses in manipulating this exact equation. They ensure that your predictions are never perfectly accurate.
Which keeps you guessing.
Exactly. By keeping the reward unpredictable, they keep the learning circuit permanently switched on. You never habituate because you never quite know the pattern.
It's essentially the same mechanism that drives foraging behavior in the wild, isn't it? I mean, if we just use the cliché slot machine analogy, we kind of miss the deep evolutionary logic of it.
That is a great point. The slot machine is too modern.
Right. Because if an animal is foraging for berries and it finds a bush that is absolutely packed with fruit one day, it is naturally going to check that exact bush the next day. But if the bush is empty the next day, the animal won't just ignore it forever. It'll probably check it again next week or next month. Nature uses these variable rewards to ensure we keep seeking resources even when they aren't immediately available.
And the phone has just synthesized that berry bush into a supernormal stimulus.
Exactly.
That foraging analogy captures the reality of the behavior perfectly, because the biological loop is not powered by contentment or satiety. If checking your phone actually deeply satisfied your psychological needs, you would put it down and not feel the compulsion to check it again for like 6 hours.
Right, you'd be full.
You would be full, but the checking behavior is sustained entirely by the tension of unpredictability. When your thumb moves to unlock that screen, you truly do not know what the environment will provide.
You could get anything.
You might get a message from someone you love. You might get absolutely nothing. You might see a genuinely hilarious piece of comedy, a terrifying geopolitical news headline, a moment of intense social validation, or literally just a mundane update about a software patch.
And a lot of the time, I mean, maybe even most of the time, you get nothing of substance.
That actually makes sense.
You do that automatic pocket grab, you unlock the screen, you swipe a few times, and you put it away feeling completely flat. Nothing memorable happened, nothing nourished you. But because of that reward prediction error, the maybe next time feeling is so strong that 10 minutes later, your hand is right back in your pocket.
The flatness you feel is actually a required feature of the system.
Wait, really? It's required?
Yes.
What?
Think about it. If you received a profound piece of joyous news every single time you looked at your device, your brain would quickly adapt to that predictable pattern. The dopamine spike would level out, and you would actually check it far less obsessively.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
It is the vast expanses of mediocrity, punctuated by random spikes of highly salient emotional input, that trigger the urge to relentlessly refresh. The possibility of reward is neurologically much more potent than the reward itself.
So if we have this device that has essentially reverse engineered our foraging instincts, we really have to look at the physics of how it competes with the physical world around us.
The competition is fierce.
It really is. Because there are moments, usually when I am highly engaged in a physical task, where I can leave the device in another room and feel totally unbothered.
Right, when you were in a flow state.
Yeah. But the moment there is friction in my physical environment, like if I'm trying to read a dense article or write a difficult email or even just wait for a delayed train, the phone completely overpowers my environment.
It steps right in.
It feels like whenever the brain is forced to choose between the physical world and the digital one, the phone wins purely because it weighs less. It's just easier.
You are describing the concepts of cognitive load and ego depletion. The brain is an incredibly energy-hungry organ. I mean, it consumes about 20% of your body's resting energy, despite being a tiny fraction of your overall body weight.
That's a massive energy drain.
It is. Consequently, evolution has trained the brain to be aggressively efficient. It constantly seeks the path of least metabolic resistance. And the physical world often demands a really high metabolic output.
Like what kind of output?
Well, deep reading requires you to hold abstract concepts in your working memory. Complex problem solving requires sustained focus. Even just walking without a podcast requires you to process your own internal dialogue, which can be emotionally taxing.
Whereas a phone asks for absolutely zero metabolic investment. You
Exactly.
don't have to imagine anything. You don't have to construct a narrative. You don't have to hold a thought in your working memory. The environment just floods your visual and auditory cortex with perfectly processed, frictionless stimuli.
And it does so without any natural boundaries.
Right.
Think about the architecture of traditional media. A book has a physical weight. You can actually feel the pages diminishing as you approach the final chapter.
You know it's ending.
A television podcast concludes, and the credits provide a visual and auditory signal that the experience is over. A newspaper physically ends. These are structural stopping cues.
That makes sense. They force a pause.
They act as natural friction points where the brain is forced to ask itself, do I want to initiate a new activity? But the modern digital feed has eliminated the stopping cue entirely. The architecture is built for infinite drift.
That sounds familiar. It really connects to what we talked about in why your attention span is getting worse. The constant proximity of a distraction completely changes the texture of how we work and think.
It absolutely does.
You aren't just choosing to engage with the distraction. You are constantly fighting the passive availability of it. And that lack of a stopping cue means you are never actually finished. You just kind of drift away from it eventually.
And that constant proximity creates a very unique psychological state called online vigilance.
Online vigilance, that is a perfect term for it.
Because the device is always within arm's reach, on your bedside table, next to your plate, near your keyboard, your brain allocates a portion of its background processing power to monitor that potential source of input.
Even when I'm not looking at it.
Even when the phone is placed face down on a desk. Your default mode network is constantly updating its map of the environment to include the real possibility of an incoming signal.
Which means we are paying a cognitive tax just for being in the same room as the device.
A literal tax on your brain power, yes.
If my brain is running a background process, keeping a subtle ear out for notification, what is that actually doing to my working memory? We talk about the fragmentation of attention a lot, but I really want to understand the mechanics of it.
Let's break it down.
How does that constant vigilance physically alter my ability to hold a thought?
The mechanism is quite literal. Working memory is a highly constrained system. You can only hold a few pieces of information in your active consciousness at any given moment.
Right, like trying to remember a phone number.
Exactly. And when a device is present, your brain is engaging in an active process of inhibition. You are subconsciously telling yourself, do not check the phone. Stay focused on the spreadsheet.
It's an active effort.
It is an active effort. That inhibitory control is generated by the prefrontal cortex, and it burns glucose. It takes actual metabolic energy to ignore a highly salient stimulus.
Wow.
So the mere presence effect means that simply having the phone in your peripheral vision reduces your available fluid intelligence because a dedicated part of your brain's processing power is tied up in the act of not touching it.
It's like trying to solve a complex math equation while physically holding a heavy weight at arm's length. You might be able to do the math, but the quality of your focus is heavily degraded because your nervous system is split between two demanding tasks.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. And the cost of that divided attention becomes intensely obvious the moment you actually succumb to the urge and switch tasks.
Because giving in feels like a relief for a second.
It does, but then you pay a massive switching cost. Every single time you interrupt a primary task to check a screen, your brain must execute a schema shift.
A schema shift.
Yes, it has to pack away the rules, the context, and the short-term memories associated with the work you were just doing and load up the completely different rules and context of the digital environment.
And I imagine that isn't instant.
Far from it. When you switch back 10 seconds later, you don't instantly resume at your previous depth. It can take minutes for the brain to fully reload the original context.
We have all experienced that jarring sensation. You glance at a text message while writing a paragraph, you look back at your laptop screen, and the entire architecture of the thought you were about to express has just totally dissolved.
It vanishes.
But I want to push back on one of the common complaints about this, which is the whole idea of boredom. We hear constantly that phones are destroying our ability to be bored. But from an evolutionary standpoint, isn't boredom just a negative affect?
In what sense?
Well, it's an unpleasant feeling meant to motivate an animal to find food or a mate. If humanity has been trying to cure boredom for centuries, why is it suddenly a crisis that we have a highly effective cure sitting in our pockets? If the phone relieves boredom, why is that actually a problem?
That is a really common question, but the flaw in that perspective lies in misunderstanding what boredom actually achieves in the modern human brain.
Okay, tell me more.
You are correct that it is an aversive state. It is naturally designed to feel uncomfortable to prompt action. However, in an environment of scarcity, that discomfort prompted exploration, creativity, and the strengthening of social bonds.
Because you had to actually go do something.
Exactly. When you experience boredom today and you instantly soothe it with a frictionless digital input, you are not actually curing the boredom. You are shifting your baseline tolerance for a lack of stimulation.
You are raising the bar for what counts as normal.
Precisely. Sensory adaptation dictates that if you constantly flood your system with high velocity, high color, highly emotional input, your nervous system adjusts to treat that heightened state as the new baseline.
So the real world starts to feel painfully slow.
Exactly. Environments that lack that velocity, a slow walk in the woods, a quiet room waiting for water to boil, they suddenly fall way below the threshold of baseline stimulation. Stillness ceases to feel like rest.
That's a scary thought.
Stillness begins to feel acutely agonizing. You haven't cured boredom, you have simply made the natural pace of the physical world feel entirely unbearable.
And if you cannot tolerate the natural pace of the physical world, you fundamentally compromise your ability to engage in deep, integrative thought.
You really do.
Because complex thinking, whether you are analyzing a philosophical concept, untangling a relationship issue, or designing a piece of software, it does not happen at the speed of a social media feed. It requires the slow, methodical linking of neural pathways.
The network theory of the brain illustrates this beautifully. Deep insight occurs when distant, seemingly unrelated nodes of information in the brain form a novel connection.
And that takes time.
It takes vast amounts of undisturbed time and a low-stress, low-input environment. The digital environment demands rapid pattern recognition, immediate emotional judgment, and instant context switching.
It's the exact opposite.
It trains the brain to prioritize the rapid consumption of distinct, disconnected facts over the slow synthesis of a coherent worldview.
I feel the physical reality of that all the time. If I sit down to read a dense piece of historical nonfiction, for the first 10 minutes, my brain is practically screaming for a quicker reward.
It is looking for the dopamine.
It isn't that the vocabulary is too difficult. It is that my attentional system has been trained to expect a hit of novelty every 15 seconds. If the author is taking 3 pages to build a nuanced argument, my brain treats that lack of speed as an error.
Your brain is requesting a channel change because it has been conditioned to equate speed with value.
That is a useful way to look at it.
And this brings us to one of the most physically exhausting consequences of this lifestyle, the accumulation of mental noise and what researchers call cognitive residue.
Cognitive residue.
Yes. There is a profound biological difference between being well-informed and being mentally saturated.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's unpack cognitive residue because I think people deeply misunderstand what they're doing when they try to relax.
Oh, absolutely.
After a long, stressful day of decision-making, you collapse onto the sofa. You feel entirely depleted, so you pull out your phone and you begin to scroll. The story we tell ourselves is that we are resting.
We think we're switching off.
Exactly, we are turning our brains off. But physiologically, based on the mechanics we are discussing, that is the exact opposite of rest, isn't it?
It is the antithesis of recovery. True physiological and cognitive recovery requires a drastic reduction in allostatic load, which is the cumulative wear and tear on your biological systems.
So rest means doing less.
Rest requires fewer decisions, a decrease in emotional arousal, less social comparison, and a complete cessation of context switching. When you scroll through a feed, you are forcing your brain to process an incredibly dense stream of fragmented reality.
How does that actually manifest in the brain? If I see a headline about a political scandal, and then 3 seconds later I swipe to a video of a dog, and then 3 seconds later I see a friend's vacation photo, what is happening chemically?
The human nervous system was not designed to process massive emotional whiplash in 3-second intervals. When you read that political headline, your amygdala registers a threat.
So it fires off an alarm.
It signals the release of a microdose of adrenaline and cortisol.
Right.
Your heart rate variability changes slightly, your physical tension increases.
But then 3 seconds later, I swipe to the dog video.
Right. Your visual cortex processes the new image of the dog, but the cortisol from the previous stimulus has not dissipated.
Because hormones take time.
Hormones do not vanish at the speed of a thumb swipe. They take minutes or even hours to clear from your bloodstream.
So the physical arousal of anger or anxiety from the news is now bleeding into the experience of watching the dog, and then bleeding into the jealousy of seeing the friend's vacation.
That is cognitive residue. You are stacking conflicting physiological states on top of each other.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. You are absorbing emotional fragments without ever giving your brain the time to fully process, contextualize, or discharge the physical arousal they create. New input arrives before the older input has been integrated.
So it just builds up.
This creates a persistent, low-grade inflammatory state in the nervous system. You stand up from the sofa after an hour of relaxing, and your body is literally carrying the unresolved physiological markers of 20 different emotional events.
It's like trying to listen to 20 different symphony orchestras playing 20 different songs while convincing yourself you are enjoying a moment of quiet reflection.
That is exactly what it feels like internally.
And the tragedy is that this lack of true recovery compounds day after day, particularly when it begins to encroach on sleep.
The disruption of the circadian rhythm is where the cognitive residue turns into a structural deficit. When you carry that heightened emotional reactivity into the bedroom, the blue light suppresses your melatonin production. But more importantly, the psychological arousal prevents your nervous system from entering the parasympathetic rest.
You're still on high alert.
You sleep poorly, which directly impairs the function of your prefrontal cortex the very next day.
Which means your impulse control is fundamentally weakened.
Yes. A sleep-deprived brain has significantly less metabolic energy available for inhibitory control.
So you have less energy to say no to the phone.
Because you are depleted, you have less willpower to resist the friction-free stimulation of the device. You check it more often, which further fragments your attention, which increases your cognitive residue, which makes you more exhausted by the evening.
Leading to more doom scrolling to numb the exhaustion.
It is a perfectly enclosed, self-sustaining feedback loop.
That loop leaves us in a state that I find completely fascinating and honestly a little terrifying. It's the condition of being always slightly stimulated.
You'd always slightly stimulated state.
Yeah. If you look at the average modern adult, we aren't walking around in a state of screaming cinematic sensory overload. We aren't collapsing in the streets from too much data. But we are also entirely alienated from deep restorative ease.
It is an insidious in-between state.
Right.
Life of partial attention. You are never fully consumed by a single task, but you are never fully disengaged either. The device fills every potential void just enough to prevent the discomfort of true boredom, but it interrupts your focus just enough to prevent the joy of true immersion.
We are just hovering.
You exist in a shallow middle zone, hovering constantly at a level of mild alertness that never peaks into profound insight and never drops into profound peace.
So what does this all mean? Which brings us to a really difficult question of terminology. When people experience this pervasive, subtle exhaustion, they often joke about it. They say, "Oh, I'm totally addicted to my phone."
It is a very common phrase.
But when you look at their lives, the traditional hallmarks of clinical addiction seem absent. They aren't bankrupting their families to buy more screen time. They hold down demanding jobs. They pay their mortgages. They maintain their marriages.
They function normally in society.
Exactly. There is no dramatic, cinematic rock bottom. So, from a behavioral science perspective, is addiction actually the correct framework for what we are living through?
The clinical definition of addiction usually requires significant impairment in daily functioning, which, as you noted, many people avoid. However, focusing solely on the clinical diagnosis misses the utility of the comparison.
How so?
The underlying neurological mechanisms, cue-driven repetition, tolerance, withdrawal, anticipatory reward, entrenched habit loops, and continued use despite a persistent sense of dissatisfaction, they are functionally identical to behavioral addictions.
The wiring is the same.
We may not want to label the entire population as clinically addicted, but we are absolutely dealing with a population-level habituation to a supernormal stimulus. There may be no dramatic rock bottom, but there is a quiet, tragic realization that the allocation of your attention is no longer under your sovereign control.
And the consequence of realizing that your attention isn't your own is a tremendous amount of guilt.
Huge amounts of guilt.
I hear this from incredibly smart, capable people all the time. They internalize the failure. They look at their screen time reports and they think, I am weak. I have no discipline. I am a flawed person who cannot even sit through a movie without checking my emails.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that framing is not just harsh, it is fundamentally scientifically inaccurate.
That explains a lot.
You do not have a character flaw. You have a brain that is functioning exactly as millions of years of evolution designed it to function. It is seeking novelty, it is conserving energy, and it is responding to variable rewards.
It's doing its job.
The issue is that your perfectly healthy brain has been placed inside an environment that was expertly intentionally engineered by some of the most sophisticated companies in human history to exploit those exact evolutionary mechanisms.
It's like blaming yourself for gaining weight when you live inside a candy factory.
Exactly that. Acknowledging the environmental design doesn't absolve you of personal responsibility, but it completely changes the nature of the task. It replaces shame with structural clarity.
That is a crucial shift in perspective.
As long as you believe you are failing at a neutral task, you will rely on willpower to fix it. And willpower is a finite, highly unreliable resource, especially when you are fatigued.
And we are always fatigued because of the cognitive residue.
Precisely. Once you understand that the system is entirely adversarial to your attention, you stop relying on willpower and you start relying on environmental friction.
Let's talk about that friction, because recognizing the hostile architecture is the first step, but we still have to live and work in the modern world. We cannot just throw these glass rectangles into the ocean.
As tempting as that sounds,
So how do we re-architect our immediate physical space to break the automaticity of the phantom grab? Because gritting my teeth and saying I will not look, that only works until about 2 in the afternoon.
you must target the basal ganglia's automatic loop by introducing micro-delays. You make the behavior just slightly more metabolically expensive.
Make it annoying to use.
Exactly. Move the apps that you open out of pure reflex, the social feeds, the news aggregators, off your primary home screen. Bury them in a folder on the 4th page. Log out of the web version so that your browser doesn't autofill the password, forcing you to manually type it out every single time. Disable biometric login for the platforms that drain you.
The lock screen seems like the most critical real estate to me. If my phone lights up with a preview of a message, my conscious brain doesn't even have time to make a decision. The orienting reflex has already snapped my eyes to the screen.
The lock screen is the ultimate trigger for the orienting reflex. By turning off every notification that is not strictly immediately essential for your physical safety or your livelihood, you neutralize the device's ability to interrupt your physical environment.
The phone should only speak when spoken to.
That is the rule.
Yeah.
Furthermore, physical distance is the most effective form of friction. If you are doing deep work, placing the phone in a different room means that checking it requires you to stand up, walk through a door, and retrieve it.
It takes actual effort.
In the 10 seconds it takes to execute that physical movement, your prefrontal cortex has enough time to step in and ask, wait, why are we doing this?
But there is a massive trap here, and I have fallen into it myself.
What trap is that?
The trap of the vacuum. I have gone through phases where I deleted all the apps, turned the screen to grayscale, and left the phone in the kitchen. And the result wasn't a sudden state of Zen-like focus.
I can imagine.
The result was that I paced around my house like a caged animal. I felt incredibly anxious because I removed the fast stimulation, but I didn't change anything else about my cognitive environment. If you create a vacuum, human nature guarantees that something will rush in to fill it.
The vacuum trap is where almost all digital detoxes fail.
That happens to a lot of people.
You cannot simply sever a deeply entrenched dopaminergic pathway and expect your brain to be happy about the sudden absence of neurochemicals. If you only focus on removal, the psychological tension will build until you inevitably re-download the apps.
Which feels like another failure.
You must actively, deliberately replace the behavior with activities that rebuild your dopamine baseline and restore your attentional endurance.
I have found that this is the hardest part. Because when your baseline is accustomed to a 3-second reward cycle, reading a chapter of a physical book feels like climbing a mountain. What kind of replacements actually work to recalibrate that system?
You have to intentionally engage in high-friction, low-velocity activities, and you have to do it knowing that it will feel unrewarding at first.
It's not going to be fun right away.
Reading a physical book, listening to a piece of classical music without doing anything else, engaging in a prolonged, unbroken conversation, walking in a park without a device.
It sounds so simple, but it's so hard.
You are fundamentally acting as a physical therapist for your attentional networks. You are placing controlled stress on the system to rebuild its capacity. You have to actively practice letting empty moments remain empty.
Just sitting there.
Allow yourself to stand in an elevator without looking down. Allow the kettle to boil while you just stare out the window.
One of the most effective interventions I've found isn't even about stopping the behavior. It's about making it conscious. The intentional question.
I love that concept.
Before my thumb unlocks the screen, I force a 1-second pause and ask, what exactly am I hiring this device to do for me right now?
That is brilliant.
If the answer is, I need to check the weather so I know what coat to wear.
Ah,
That's a brilliant use of a tool. If the answer is, I am feeling a vague sense of existential dread about my career and I want to numb my consciousness for 20 minutes, well, at least I am looking the reality in the eye.
you're being honest.
That single question disrupts the automaticity.
Bringing the behavior out of the basal ganglia and into the prefrontal cortex is the essence of behavioral change. And this leads to a critical realization about the timeline of this process. When you begin to implement this friction and you start asking that intentional question, it is not going to feel liberating.
No, it
It
is
is going to feel intensely irritating.
because the brain has physically adapted its receptor densities.
Exactly right. The principle of neuroplasticity cuts both ways. Your brain has physically altered its architecture to accommodate a fire hose of high-velocity stimulation. When you turn that fire hose off, you experience a mild form of dopaminergic withdrawal.
So when people try to put their phones away and they feel agitated, restless, and deeply bored, they usually interpret that as failure. They think, I can't do this, I am just too addicted, my attention span is permanently broken.
But that is not true.
What you are saying is that the discomfort isn't a sign of failure. The discomfort is the physical sensation of the brain recalibrating.
The restlessness is the proof that the intervention is actually working. Your brain is actively relearning how to generate its own internal stimulation.
That's so encouraging.
Downregulated dopamine receptors take time to replenish. It takes time for the associative networks to realize they have the space to stretch out and make complex connections again. If you can endure that initial period of intense, itchy boredom without reaching for the glass rectangle, the baseline eventually resets.
You come out the other side.
The slow rhythm of the physical world becomes vivid and deeply satisfying once more.
Which makes me wonder about the trajectory of where this is all heading. Because right now we are having a profound societal struggle with a piece of glass that we carry in our pockets. There is still a physical barrier.
You still have to pick it up.
You have to reach for it, you have to look down at it, but the technology is rapidly moving towards spatial computing, augmented reality glasses, and eventually direct neural interfaces.
The barriers are shrinking.
If we have not mastered the psychological architecture required to handle a smartphone, if we cannot even resist a device that requires physical movement to access what happens to our cognitive baseline, when the infinite feed is permanently overlaid onto our visual field with zero physical friction.
That is the existential question of the next decade. If the friction between intention and digital stimulation drops to absolute zero, the biological safeguards that protect our working memory and our emotional baseline will be completely bypassed.
We won't stand a chance.
We will not have the luxury of putting the device in another room. The environment will be integrated into our biology. That is why establishing these internal boundaries and understanding the mechanics of how our attention is hijacked is not just a productivity hack.
It's survival.
It is a necessary evolution of our psychological immune system.
We have to build the internal architecture now while there is still a physical object we can actually put down. Because when you step back and look at the actual texture of a meaningful human life, the most profound experiences are inherently slow and entirely frictionless averse.
They require patience.
Deep, connective intimacy is slow. The mastery of a complex skill is agonizingly slow. Grief, recovery, and genuine satisfaction operate on a rhythm that simply cannot be accelerated by a microchip. The goal isn't to reject the technology, but to ensure that the quiet, empty spaces of our lives, the spaces where we actually become who we are not silently consumed by a system that profits from our distraction.
When you reclaim your tolerance for stillness, you are ultimately reclaiming your sovereignty over your own mind. Thanks for listening to TalkKast.